Okay, we're picking up with U.S. History Regents exam. This is June of 2016. And we're going to pick up with question 33 here of the multiple choice. So once again, these are multiple choice questions with documents of different kinds, and sometimes they give you a chart or a map. Sometimes they give you a political cartoon or a photograph. In this case, you've got a photograph on the left there from the National Archives, and on the right, that's actually a reproduction of a poster that went out from the Office of War Information. Always contextualize these things as far as you can. Look at the information they give you. So we see that they're from 42 and 43. That should tell you right away you are dealing with the war. We are in the middle of World War II. On the left, we've got women workers chipping paint. This is, just so we know, when you build a steel structure, whether it's a ship or a, some kind of a highway or something like that, bridge, you paint the steel to keep it from rusting. When you need to repaint it, you've got to chip all of that paint off, and you use those kind of it's like mini jackhammer numbers there to chip the paint off of it so that you get a nice bare surface to repaint. That's what they're doing with it. That was certainly normally work at the time for men. That's all really guys' job, pretty heavy work. On the right here, you've got this poster. It's the woman there, and she is inside. You may not recognize it, so I'll just tell you. It's a plexiglass dome, so a kind of plastic dome, which was used on aircraft. So that looks like it's that would have been in the nose of a bomber, and that's where the bombardier would have been, so that he could see what he was doing when he was aiming the aircraft. So she's working, obviously, therefore, in an aircraft factory is the idea. Okay, so we look at they're both official. It's another thing to know about the context. This is from the Office of War Information, the OWI, which during World War II was the official U.S. government office that was kind of the public relations press office, if you like. The other side there is from the Marin Ship Corporation, which was a shipbuilding company, and it's from the National Archives. So this is again, the official sort of library down in Washington of documents. Okay, so the point of view, if you like, of these is going to be from the government side, patriotic American, all that. The more women at work, the sooner we win. Okay, and we've got this woman here working in an aircraft factory. Women are needed also as farm workers, waitresses, timekeepers. Timekeepers were people who worked in factories who oversaw basically things like payroll, because you had a card that punched in and punched out. So they know how many hours you had worked, and there's a lot of record keeping. Laundresses, teachers, elevator operators. That's kind of weird to us now, but in the 40s, you still had a lot of elevators that were hand operated. You didn't just press a button. You had a guy who had a little lever and had to get it right to get it directly on the floor to open it up. Bus drivers, typists, salespeople, taxi drivers, messengers, conductors, as in conductors on trains, and in hundreds of other war jobs. So a lot of these jobs were typically male. Waitresses and laundresses were typically female. Teachers were mixed. Lower grade teachers were almost all women. High school teachers were mixed. Most of the rest of these jobs, bus drivers, taxi drivers, that sort of thing, were typically male. So they're trying to recruit women. Now, the more women at work, the sooner we win. What does that mean? What's the logic to this? The World War II, the U.S. Army became massive. You had a million guys under arms, and they were being drafted all the time. And we were having trouble keeping up with the number of men we needed. The first guys you want to get your hands on are guys who are young and athletic, right? Because being a soldier, particularly in those days, was a very physical activity. There was no drones that you were piloting. You were out in the field. So your best bet was you wanted a lot of 18, 19, 20, 21, 22-year-old guys who were in good shape. They started to run out of those. So they start drafting older guys, 23, 24, 25, and guys who are in maybe not as great shape or have, some minor health issues. By the end of the war, we were really kind of recruiting a lot of guys who had a lot of issues and were older, guys who were 30, and who had flat feet and other issues were being pulled in anyway. The more women that you had working in men's jobs, the fewer men you needed to do them. The American economy continued to have to function. After all, this army needed to be supplied. You couldn't have an Army Air Corps, which was the World War II version of the Air Force, of course, without planes. But you couldn't have planes unless somebody made them. But every guy who was working in an aircraft factory was one less guy you could put out in the field. So, during the war, they did a couple of things. One, they drafted men. We know this. There were certain guys that they did not draft and would not take into the military. Able-bodied, young, fit, but they had a skill. So if you were a skilled worker in certain trades and you tried to join the Army would tell you, no, son, we need you. You're a skilled machinist. You are much more valuable to the country working in a factory making metal parts than you are out in the field. Anybody can carry a rifle, but not that many guys are trained to do that kind of precision tool and die making. So guys who were in essential occupations were not just exempt, but they were discouraged from signing up. And second, they recruited women for jobs that had traditionally been held by men. So, all of a sudden, American factories started to fill up with women doing what had traditionally been men's jobs. Things like riveting. Rosie the Riveter, you guys have heard of, right? That was a real thing to get women to do construction jobs that had traditionally been men. To do that, though, you had to first ask women to do it. You had to convince women that they were actually needed. So you had recruiting posters like this. Second, you had to convince women that they could do the job. And so there were all sorts of films. When you went to the movies, no television, of course, in those days, but people went to the movies often 2, 3, 4 times a week. And you were offered short films between the main movies showing, happy women, showing you what their jobs were in the aircraft factory and how they did it, to kind of put the idea in women's minds, hey, that looks like, I never thought I could build a plane, but maybe I can. If she can do it, maybe I can. And so they tried to encourage women to come in. And third, this is interesting, but you're my sophisticated, smart guys. Notice this woman over here. And notice these women. This is an actual photograph of women doing the work. And you see they're in boots and overalls, and they're wearing that stuff on their head because women tended in those days to wear their hair longer. So this was what kept it kind of under control so it didn't get in your way. And, you know, they're not fashion models. Now we look at the official poster. And what's the official poster? Here she is. Her nails are done. She's got makeup, lipstick, right? Pretty good looking woman. Why? Because one thing you wanted to convince women of was, first, we need you. Second, you can do the job. And third, and that's what this poster is about, if you do this job, if you come and work in a factory, you are not going to stop being a woman. You're not going to lose your femininity. You're not going to lose your prettiness. You're not going to look like a construction worker yourself. Don't worry. You can come do this and still, the guys will still think you're an attractive woman. Okay. So that's part of what the recruiting campaign had to convince women. That's why when you see the official pictures of the Rosie the Riveters of the age, the women they always look good. They have always got makeup on. They, women could see themselves say, yeah, I'd like to be that. Okay. Well, now we get to the question at hand. The photographs and posters showing scenes similar to these were used by the federal government to recruit women to fill wartime manufacturing jobs. I'll also point out, because you're my very special guys, what happens at the end of the war? There's a big effort to get women back home. The guys all come home from the army. They're all discharged from the army. They're all looking to get their jobs back. And you had to convince women, okay, now the war is over. Now what we really need is good old-fashioned wives and moms. So get the hell out of the factory, clear out those jobs, and go back to making meatloaf for the family and, wiping Johnny's nose and making sure Jane has her lunchbox with her, because that's what we need now. 34. Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, the GI Bill, also called the GI Bill of Rights. So what is the point of the GI Bill? Let's do a little work here. Whammo. Okay. We didn't want to repeat a mistake we had made at the end of previous wars. At the end of the Civil War, we had sent guys home, the war ends, and we had sent guys home basically with little to nothing. And a lot of guys had a huge amount of trouble readjusting to civilian life. At the end of World War I, we had done the same thing. We had about 4 million guys in the military. We discharged them all at once. They had a lot of trouble finding jobs. A lot of them had a lot of trouble readjusting to civilian life. And there had been a big dip in the national economy that it took a while to get the economy restarted. After World War II, we wanted to not make that mistake again. So in 1944, as it becomes clear that the war is going to end soon, they come up with this idea for the GI Bill of Rights. When guys got out of the military, they would be entitled to education benefits. So job retraining, so you get out of the military, if you think about it, right? Guy's been in the military, he's gone on, went in at 18. He's getting out, he's now 20, 21. He's not college material, he wants to go into a trade or profession, but Normally, he would have spent 18, 19, 20 learning a job. He would have been learning how to be a tool and die maker, or a machinist, or a press operator, or something like that. He hadn't had any of that. He was behind, if you like. So it provided money to guys to go learn a new job, learn a new skill, in the hope that that would help them get employed again. It also, though, gave money for college. If a guy wanted to go to college, he could afford it now. Before this, college was the province of a small handful of Americans, mostly wealthy kids, prep school kind of kids whose daddies had been to Yale and Harvard and Dartmouth, and they had gone, and a handful of very ambitious people from the working class. New York had long had the City College of New York, CCNY, which is still part of CUNY, which was called the poor man's Harvard. And if you were a really ambitious kid, you didn't have to have any money, but you could go there and you could get a good education and come out and become an accountant or a lawyer or something like that. But a lot of people just didn't have the money to take off the time to go to college. The GI Bill of Rights paid for all that. And so these guys coming out of the Army now had the opportunity to go. What could you study in college under the GI Bill? And the answer was anything. So there were guys who came out, went to college on the GI Bill and got a degree in accounting or business, and that was good. There were also guys who came out, went and got degrees in art or in literature. Some of the great writers and artists of America in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s were guys who had done this, had gone to college on the GI Bill. A lot of these guys took philosophy courses. Philosophy, sure. They had just been through the war, and they wanted to figure out what the hell was the point of life. They had seen a lot of life. These guys fill up colleges, and colleges respond. I should say it changes higher education as much as it changes the guys. Some of the great colleges in the country, including a lot of Catholic colleges in particular, Fordham, Boston College, Manhattan College, places like that, suddenly expand hugely in size because they have this whole new group of guys who want to go and can pay for it. Well, what would a professor think of having a room full of these ex-soldiers? And the answer is they loved them. They thought they were terrific. Why? They're not snotty-nosed, 18-year-old little boys who don't know what to do with themselves, so they're hanging out in college, playing games, and are more concerned with joining a frat than they are with studying. No, these guys are a little older. They're starting freshman year as a 21-year-old, 22-year-old, who have already seen some of the most horrific things a man will ever see, who have been through hardship and difficulty, who have learned how to work together, who have had to deprive themselves. They've matured tremendously. And why are they going to college? Because they want to. Not just because they couldn't figure out what else to do, or because they thought it would be a big party. They're going because they really do have a thirst to learn, and they want to make something of themselves, and they have some ambition to them. So the guys who go on the GI Bill to these colleges, they swell the size of these colleges. It starts to make higher education, college, closer to being the rule than the exception. You go back to the 20s and 30s, a small percentage of kids, actually a small percentage of kids finished high school, and a very small percentage of high school graduates went to college. By the 60s, most high school kids were, or a lot of high school kids, I should say, were looking at college. Now most high school kids at least look at college, right? And that all starts to change with the GI Bill. And these guys really do. They study poetry and English literature, philosophy, theology, politics, political science, and out of this comes an awful lot of some of the great men, great journalists, great thinkers, politicians of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The other thing the GI Bill of Rights gave these guys was home loans. So these guys are coming back from the military. They're right off the boat. And what do they want to do? They want to start a family. Some of them were married. They had gone off to war and left, a wife at home. Some of them had gotten married. They had a girlfriend, and on the way off to war, they got married at the last moment, or they got married, they came home on leave for a couple of weeks and got married. Some of them came back single men, but now was the time to find that high school sweetheart again and, lock it down, so to speak, and start a family. Well, it's an awful lot to start, right? So you're going to start looking around for a place to live. And living in the apartment in Brooklyn with mom and dad, now that you're married and trying to have kids, this is going to be kind of a problem. And so the government says, tell you what, we will guarantee you a loan, low interest rate, so you can go buy a house. Well, okay, that's great. It turns an awful lot of city apartment dwellers into house owners. But you need houses to do it. So what does that lead to? The suburbs. All of a sudden, Nassau County on Long Island, big chunks of Staten Island, parts of Jersey, parts of Westchester, parts of Connecticut, and that's just in this area. You see these developers putting up dozens and dozens and dozens of houses to accommodate these young servicemen. And so out on Long Island, you get the Levitt towns, yeah? So there you go. You get developments of things like this. So the little house, the starter house, fence, a little walkway, and there you go, mom, dad, and the 3 kids, and little salt box, as we call this style of house, to get you going. Right. Okay, that's nice. Huh? That's not a suburb, though. One house is not a suburb. That's Levittown. It's hundreds of little houses just like that, line after line, row after row, street after street. These are all thrown up all at once. This is Levittown in Pennsylvania. There were Levittowns on Long Island and other parts of the country named for this guy Levitt who built them. But you had suburbs like this grow up all over the place because these guys needed a place to live. With the suburbs, though, also came other things. You needed a way to get to and from the suburbs. And so you get this mass explosion in highways. Late 40s and into the 1950s, we build the interstate highway system, and then all the highways that you guys might be familiar with. It's in the 60s, they finally get around to doing the Staten Island Expressway, the West Shore Expressway, the Korean War Veterans Parkway. There were actually supposed to be several other highways built on Staten Island. Over the bridge, the Belt Parkway, the Gowanus, and then the Long Island Expressway is joined by the northern and southern states, the New Jersey Turnpike. Some of these projects have been going on for a while, but a lot of them are built in the wake of the war, and the suburbs grow up around them, and they grow up with the suburbs. that leads to a lot of problems. So the young GI, he gets out of the military, gets his home loan, gets married to the high school sweetheart, off they go. It's 47, 48, and they're living in one of these suburbs, and they start having kids, lots of kids. You can't build schools fast enough. The schools are overcrowded out there. You can't build playgrounds and parks fast enough because the little kids, you got to take them somewhere for a walk, right? Supermarkets and shopping centers start getting thrown up because there's not enough of them. So one of the early problems in the late 40s and into the early 50s is the suburbs grew so fast, a lot of those kinds of services didn't grow with them. So the GI Bill, which just says, hey, returning servicemen, we'll pay for your education, we'll help you out getting a house, has this massive impact across the board on American society, on our education, on our higher educational institutions, on the expectations people have about things like college, on the creation of suburbs and the idea that people aren't going to live in apartments in the city anymore. That everybody's going to have their own little house with their own little yard, and we're going to have to build schools to deal with it, and we're going to have PTAs in the schools, and. So the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944 provides education and home loan benefits for soldiers returning from World War II. Answer 2. Once again, though, you need to kind of know all of that because sometimes they ask about suburban overcrowding. Sometimes they ask about higher education. Harry Truman, President Truman's decision to drop atomic bombs on Japan was based on the belief that the action would do what? Save American lives by avoiding an invasion of Japan. We're at the end of the war. It's August of 1945, or very early August, first few days of August. And Truman is got a problem. The U.S. has developed in the Manhattan Project an atomic bomb. We actually have developed 3 atomic bombs. We built 3 of them. One of them we set off in the desert out in the southeast U.S., in Alamogordo, New Mexico. We blew it up to see if it would work. That was in July. Well, it worked. So then the next question was, what do we do? We have 2 more. Japan had no idea. But by the way, Germany had already surrendered. That was all done and over for a few months by then. Okay, Germany falls really in April and beginning of May of 45. So we're in July of 45. We've tested this one bomb we have. We've got 2 more ready to go. And Truman's got to figure out what to do. He's got a massive invasion of Japan in preparation. We've got men, we've got ships, we've got material that they're starting to build up. We had done the island hopping campaign throughout the Pacific. We had taken island after island after island, getting closer and closer to Japan. That had been a bloody and difficult way to do it. So, for instance, when the United States invaded Okinawa, which is one of the islands off Japan, not only had the Japanese themselves fought absolutely bitterly right to the last man, but we had to watch, really not able to prevent it, hundreds of civilians throwing themselves and their children off of the cliffs of Okinawa. The Japanese had been told that if the Americans capture you, they will rape your women and your children to death, and they will torture all of you, and you will all be killed. So the Japanese, convinced of this, decided it was better to just, commit suicide. Their troops would not surrender. Even if they were surrounded, it was hopeless to fight. The fear was, therefore, if that's happening on these outlying islands, what happens when we actually invade the main islands of Japan itself? We may win. We have all of the equipment, the resources that we would eventually win. But boy, is this going to be a horrific fight, and you're going to have hundreds of thousands, maybe millions killed. On the other hand, we have these 2 atomic bombs. There's a thought. Maybe if we invite the Japanese to watch us blow these up on some island someplace, they'll get the message that they could be next. And the general feeling was that wouldn't be enough to convince them. So Truman decides to go ahead and drop the first bomb, the uranium-based bomb, on Hiroshima, which was is a city in the southern part of Japan. It is a city. It is full of civilians. It was full of school kids. It was full of families. The bomb itself actually fell. It exploded in the air. It was intended to explode in the air, but it exploded in the air right over a hospital. So it's a city we're bombing. However, the city was a center for war production. It was an industrial city that had a lot of military hardware plants in it. So Truman decides, okay, let's set it off. Let's do it. Let's bomb Hiroshima, and then tell the Japanese, you better surrender or we'll do it again. So we bomb Hiroshima. The Japanese have no idea what's hit them. They had no idea that we had developed an atomic weapon. The idea of a theoretical thing called an atomic weapon had kicked around for some years among physicists, but nobody had figured out how to do one, everybody thought. And so the Japanese were not, they thought, there were a lot of Japanese who thought, for instance, that we had spread some kind of a mist of gasoline over the town and ignited it all at once or something. They couldn't figure it out. The Japanese government hesitates. We drop the bomb, we tell them surrender, and they don't do anything. So a couple of days later, we drop the second bomb on Nagasaki. At that point, the Japanese government, not knowing that we only had the 2 bombs, assuming that we had a stockpile of these things, decided, okay, that's it. And they gave up and they surrendered. So the war ended then in August, and they signed, there was a formal ceremony, surrender document ceremony in September of 45. So the point of that, Harry Truman, and it is still debated to this day. There are still people who debate to this day whether or not it was the right decision to do it and to do it that way. But Truman's logic, and he defended it to the end of his life, was it was a horrible thing. It was a terrible loss of life to use those 2 weapons. But had we not, it would have been, the loss of life would have been far greater to get Japan to surrender by a conventional invasion. Okay. Question 36. All right. So, another political cartoon. So what do we have here? The basket is European recovery. Marshall Plan. They're trying to sink the basket, get the Marshall Plan in. That's the goal, is European recovery. The Marshall Plan, as you recall, is named for General George C. Marshall, who right after World War II, he is actually Some people forget this. Eisenhower was the overall commander in Europe. MacArthur was the overall commander in the Pacific. Both of them, their boss was General Marshall, who spent the war in Washington because FDR needed him in Washington to coordinate the whole shooting match. When Truman becomes president, Truman makes Marshall his Secretary of State. So he becomes a civilian, retires from the military, becomes Secretary of State. Marshall comes up with a plan. Europe and Japan have been devastated, wiped, smashed by this war. How do we get these just scorched earth areas back up and running again? Part of it is kind of humanitarianism. There are people starving. There are people who are homeless. There are people who are displaced. They need to have an economy to start being able to support themselves. Part of it is political. An unstable, economically depressed country is one that is ripe for dictatorship. Hitler had come to power in part because Germany was so economically devastated in the late 20s and early 30s. We didn't want a repeat of that. So a prosperous country is a stable country, tends to be a politically moderate country. And third, the stronger those countries were, the more they could stand up to the Soviet Union. The Russians were looking to move and take as much of Europe as they could. So the stronger we made Germany, and eventually what's going to be West Germany, France, Italy, the less likely they would be to either develop a new dictator or go communist themselves or be subject to invasion by the Soviets. So Marshall came up with a plan by which the United States would kind of flood dollars into Europe and to a degree also to Japan to get their own industries back up and running and make their economies flourish again. That's the Marshall Plan. This guy here is Joseph Stalin. The big mustache and that big ham head, people would have recognized as Stalin right away, and there he's got the hammer and sickle of the Soviet Union on his shirt there. Okay, and the question, can he block it? Stalin hated the Marshall Plan because it would have gotten in the way of everything he was trying to do and would have made all of those countries friendly allies of the United States, which was the last thing he wanted. Okay. And what, by the way, in Europe was the organization we started? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which was a military alliance. It wasn't civilian like the Marshall Plan, by which these countries became military allies of the U.S. in case they were ever invaded by the Soviets. Okay. Which United States effort is the Soviet Union responding to in this cartoon? An attempt to stabilize the economy of Western Europe. There's the answer. Okay. 37. Greece receives U.S. aid to fight communists. U.S. military airlift supplies to Berlin. U.S. troops sent to defend South Vietnam. All of these illustrate U.S. commitment to a policy of containment. So throughout the 50s and 60s, you have to look at absolutely everything that happens, domestically and internationally, as far as the U.S. is concerned, through the lens of the Cold War. All of it is always all about the Cold War. And the goal of the Cold War was to prevent communism from spreading. We took several approaches to that. One was containment. There was no way we were going to change the Soviet Union, but we could keep the Soviet Union and Chinese communism from spreading to other countries. We could contain it. So in Greece, this is the early part of the Cold War. There was a lot of political turmoil. So the U.S. flooded the country with money to stabilize it, and so that the moderate political parties would be stronger than the Communist Party. In Berlin, we know that at the end of the war, Germany was split into East Germany, which was controlled by the Soviets, and West Germany, which was controlled by the US, Britain, and France. Berlin sits as an island in the middle of East Germany. If you look at a map, the city of Berlin sits in the middle of East Germany. But the city of Berlin itself was split into half, East and West, and East Berlin was controlled by the Soviets, and West Berlin was controlled by the US and Britain and France. So in 1948, the Soviets surrounded West Berlin and cut it off from the rest of the world. So the US organized the Berlin Airlift, by which we kept an entire city supplied not just with all the food, medicine, and other goods it needed, but even heating oil and coal it needed because it was winter, by airplane. There was a small airport, and the U.S. had an ingenious system of being able to keep massive numbers of planes landing, one at a time, landing, dumping their loads, taking off again within seconds, and followed by another plane coming in. It was a masterpiece of coordination, but it saved West Berlin, and the Soviets finally gave up and said, we're not going to be able to starve them out. U.S. troops sent to defend South Vietnam. The whole point of the Vietnam War was trying to keep communism from North Vietnam from taking over South Vietnam. So all of that is about containment. Isolationism was the U.S. policy before, primarily before World War II, saying the U.S. shouldn't be involved in any other problems in the rest of the world. Imperialism was that policy late 1800s, early 1900s, around the time of the Spanish-American War, the acquisition of Hawaii, all of that dollar diplomacy and big stick diplomacy, where we were trying to create this sort of network of what were really colonies. We didn't call them that, but that's what they were. Isolationism and imperialism have nothing to do with the Cold War. Containment does. The other word there is détente. Détente is a French word. It means relaxation. In the 1970s, President Nixon and Secretary of State Kissinger promoted an idea of détente. Maybe we could find a way to sort of peacefully coexist with the Soviet Union and Communist China. We didn't have to be sort of constantly at war with them. We could sort of learn to leave each other alone. That was the idea of détente. But these headlines, or alleged headlines, are really about containment. Okay, let's look at, whoops, nope, too high. 38. Alger Hiss conviction, Rosenberg trial, McCarthy hearings. Okay, so Alger Hiss was a Soviet spy who was a plant in the U.S. Department of State. This is the late 1940s. Rosenberg trial. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were Soviet spies in the U.S. nuclear weapons program, again, very late 1940s. McCarthy hearings. This was Senator Joseph McCarthy, 1950s, who went hunting for communists throughout the U.S. government. Alger Hiss really was a spy. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg really were spies. The McCarthy hearings accused a heck of a lot of people of being spies on little or no evidence. Basically, he turned the fear of Soviet spies into a weapon to destroy political opponents, to destroy people he just didn't like, and to make himself look like a hero. That's McCarthyism. These post-World War II events are most closely associated with the fear of a communist threat inside the United States. Hiss and Rosenberg cases were real spy cases. McCarthy played on those fears to say, well, there's communists everywhere in our government. 1957, launch of Sputnik by Soviet Union. Okay, so what's the deal with Sputnik? We have to go back a bit. World War II. Germany had developed a lot of cutting-edge weapons. One of them, or two of them, were the V1 and the V2. The V stood for Vergeltungswaffe, which is German for vengeance weapon. The V1 was the so-called buzz bomb, and it was an early version of a jet engine. The V2 was a rocket, a true ballistic rocket. So the V1 was kind of like an unmanned, long-range mini airplane that was a flying bomb that they would send from Europe across the Channel to hit Britain. The V2 was a rocket that would go up, straight up, and make this enormous parabola, this high arc, to come down wherever you wanted it to. And it was the first really successful military rocket, as we think of one. At the end of the war, the U.S. and the Soviets grabbed as many German scientists as we could get our hands on. There was a famous U.S. military operation called Operation Paperclip, where we picked up all of these scientists, including all of their rocket scientists. So, led by a guy named Wernher von Braun, who was the head rocket scientist. And a lot of these guys were not, they were an odd group. They were not necessarily huge Nazi fans themselves, but they kind of didn't care. Like, they didn't have any big moral objections to the Nazis. All they liked to do was be scientists. So Wernher von Braun didn't show a heck of a lot of interest one way or the other in Nazism, but he went along with Nazism quite happily and energetically because the Nazis would pay his bills so he could play with his rockets. There's something really morally depraved about that in some of our opinions. But anyway, we pick up von Braun and a whole bunch of his associate scientists and take them to the United States. We capture several unused V2 rockets, and we put them to work in the U.S. trying to figure out how we build our own rockets. Von Braun had long had a kind of a scientific dream of getting to the moon, of somehow, someday sending a rocket to the moon. Well, 1950s were a long way from that. So we start off with just trying to get a rocket that will get in the air. And we have a lot of trouble. The United States has a lot of trouble doing this. It's far more complicated than you might think if you don't know anything about the science. The jet fuel, dealing with the weight of the rocket, all of this stuff. One of the things we wanted to do, in addition to making a rocket that we could shoot way high in the air and have it come down wherever we wanted, like shoot it from the United States way up and have it hit the Soviet Union, We also wanted to figure out a way to get satellites in the air, to be able to put a payload, an object, high enough and have it moving fast enough that it will circle the Earth. And we are used to satellites now. In your cell phones, the reason your GPS works, the reason your cell phone knows where you are at any given second, is in part because of the GPS satellite system, which can pinpoint within about a 2-foot margin of error any place on Earth exactly where an electronic device is, if it's got the right code in it. That's a string of satellites that are geostationary, for those of you into the science of this, around the Earth. So 1950s, we haven't done any of that yet. We are hoping, how do we do this? Can we get this to do it? We keep putting rockets on the pad. They keep blowing up on us because the fuel is very tricky to do, and we get them to shoot up, but they don't go that high, and we're trying to figure out how to do that. All of a sudden, 1957, the Soviets put Sputnik up out of the blue. Sputnik is Russian for satellite. That's Sputnik. That's all it is. You see, it's this silver ball. It's roughly, I don't know, about twice the size of a basketball, about double the size of a basketball, more or less. It's got these 4 antennas sticking out of it. And the Russians shot it up in the air, and they got it high enough and moving fast enough that it achieved orbit. And it zipped around the Earth every about hour and a half or so. It made a pass over, it made a complete circuit of the Earth. So it was moving pretty fast. And it beeped. That may not sound terribly scary to you, but it beeped. If you had a radio set, a ham radio set, amateur radio set, so you had to get something other than the standard AM, FM band, you could listen to it as it passed overhead. You couldn't see it. There were people who thought that they could see it. They couldn't. It's way too small to see. But you could see the rocket, the booster rocket that had put it up there, sort of trailed along behind it. And if the light was just right, you could see the light bouncing off of that. So people thought they saw the satellite itself, but they didn't really. But if you tuned in, you could listen to it beep as it went overhead. It had a few very simple scientific instruments on it. It could, for pressure and temperature. But the thing about it was, first, that the Russians had done it first. We had no idea. I take that back. The government knew. It was not that much of a surprise to President Eisenhower or the intelligence guys. We knew that they had been working on rockets. We knew that they were pretty close. It wasn't that much of a shock to us. But to the average American in the street, it absolutely knocked their socks off. They had no idea the Russians had anything like this technology. And even though it's just a big silver basketball that beeped, they had done something scientifically that the Americans had not been able to accomplish. It terrified us. What terrified us even more was that it zipped around the Earth, as I said, about every hour and a half, including over the United States. Like it zipped right overhead. If they could put Sputnik over the U.S., what else could they put over the U.S.? Who knew? They might be able to put an atomic bomb, because we knew they had those. And so this was terrifying to Americans. It panicked us. So the immediate response to it was to change America's educational curriculum. You guys take algebra and geometry and algebra 2 and trig and calculus and all that. You take biology, chemistry, physics, and then advanced sciences, all of that kind of stuff. If you had gone to a typical high school, Catholic or public, in the 1930s, you would have taken a lot more in the way of foreign language, a lot more in the way of English composition, and a lot less in terms of math and science. Through 4 years of high school, generally, you probably would have gotten, you probably would not have gotten to calculus. You would have gotten through trig, was about as high as you would have gotten. You might have taken chemistry or physics, not both, or chemistry or earth science. You probably wouldn't have taken earth science at all, but biology and chemistry kind of would have been enough of the sciences. Because of Sputnik, Americans panic that American kids are all suddenly dumb. They're all stupid, they're all backward. And we aren't producing any smart kids, and we're not producing kids who are engineers, and they can't compete with the Russians, and the Russians are going to come and they're going to bomb us all and kill us all, and we better do something. So America's high school curriculum and grammar school curriculum starts to become much more math and science heavy, and there's a much larger push to push kids into engineering and science college curriculum. The truth is that that was all panic. American kids were actually quite well educated. They were getting more than enough math and science, and we were producing plenty of engineers, scientists, and mathematicians. It's just that the Russians lucked out and got Sputnik up there first. The U.S. followed fairly soon with our own satellites, but then the Russians beat us again. They put the first man into space. So they put Yuri Gagarin, who was a Soviet pilot, into a space capsule. And again, he'd made a couple of orbits of the Earth. He wasn't to the moon yet. U.S. eventually put John Glenn up, and so in 1961, John F. Kennedy announced that the U.S. was going to put a man on the moon in this decade and return him safely to Earth. And in 1969, just within the decade, the U.S. finally did land a man on the moon. Neil Armstrong, went to the moon in the Apollo program. That was largely done because we wanted to beat the Russians there. The truth is, the Russians never put a man on the moon. They did put a couple of robot vehicles up there, but they never actually put a human being on the moon. And neither has any other country. The U.S. to this day is the only country that's put a man on another surface. But the Sputnik set off the space race competition. Who was going to get there first? Some of it had to do with national pride. A lot of it had to do with fear that if we didn't, the Soviets would figure out a way to turn it into a military advantage. So we get back to our question. 1957 launch of Sputnik by the Soviet Union embarrassed the United States because it appeared that the United States had failed to keep up in scientific achievement with the Soviets. Okay, number 40 here. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. Okay, so 1960, John F. Kennedy is elected President of the United States. And so in January 61, he takes the oath of office. This is from his inaugural address, in which he announced the Peace Corps. So the idea of the Peace Corps was the U.S., of course, has an army, a war operation. which we used around the world to protect our allies. But he wanted to inspire young people, college kids and kids really just out of college, who wanted to give back to the world what they could do for their country and for the world. And so the Peace Corps went around the world bringing teachers and engineers mostly. So they would go into a town in some of these impoverished countries, say in Africa or Asia, and set up a school to help the kids learn, read and write, basic math, help them advance, and also build things like a good, clean, safe, fresh water system for them to have drinking water and irrigate their fields and that sort of business. So the Peace Corps was set up by Kennedy. In part, it was a way to get young people to think about, how do I ask not what somebody can do for me, but what I can do for others. But it was also about the Cold War. If we made the United States the good guys, the friendly guys, the helpful guys to these impoverished countries, they would turn to us as allies. If we didn't, the Soviets would get there first, and they would come in with money and help and all this, and those countries would wind up being allies of the Soviets. Okay. I'll just point out these other objects here. The World Bank was not an American creation. It was, the idea of it was a way to stabilize the world economy. The Organization of American States, OAS, is really an organization of primarily Latin American, South and Central American countries, kind of a treaty organization. And SEATO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, is the Southeast Asian version of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So just as NATO was meant to defend Europe from the Soviets, SEATO was meant to defend primarily South Vietnam, but other South Asian countries from the Soviets and the Chinese. And that was really the way the U.S. got, part of the way the U.S. got involved in Vietnam. All right, I'm going to leave that there for this video. We'll pick up with question 41 next time.